What about celiac disease and Neolife products? And the issue here is that celiac is a reactivity to gluten that can be anywhere from mild to severe. It's a permanent, genetically based intolerance. It's kind of a strange thing because IgE levels, which are usually the mark for allergy, are not elevated in celiac. Skin testing seldom causes the typical wheal that would be characteristic of an allergy. And also you don't see the elevation of IgE antibodies. Damage to the gut can be serious when a person has celiac. The little villi in the intestine can actually disintegrate. And when you have that disintegration, it opens the portal of the gut to absorption of all kinds of things that can initiate allergy and autoimmune response. Now the amount of gluten in GNLD products is pretty minuscule. It wasn't actually detectable until they improved the testing where they could detect very, very tiny amounts of things. So it's not a major issue because like vitamin E or the trianin, it's the oil and not the gluten that the gluten is the protein in the wheat. And so the problem there is small. But it's possible that someone that's extremely reactive to gluten might need to avoid things derived from wheat. I haven't seen that as a major problem. There is a laboratory. One of the problems with gluten intolerance is the testing has been very poor until relatively recently, and there is a lab called Cyrex Labs where they actually traditionally they just look for two of the components of gluten to see if a person was allergic. But there's many more fractions of the gluten that a person can react to. And Cyrex Labs tests for the whole gamut of those things. So that is the most accurate test for celiac disease. Dr. Alessio Fasano in 2003 established the incidence of celiac as 1 in 133 people, which was 100 times more frequent than previous estimates. His research team discovered zonulin, which is kind of the gatekeeper for the gut. There's something in the gut called a tight junction that determines whether things are absorbed or whether they aren't. And one of the problems in celiac is that gate seems to be open all the time, and these people with celiac, they tend to have upregulated zonulin. So that gateway tends to keep open, and gluten can feed that and keep that zonulin level elevated. This is a genetically determined trait, and most of the people with celiac have one of two gene types that predispose them to the problem. And if they continue to eat a lot of gluten, it can predispose them to about 168 different diseases, including multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, pancreas, diabetes, and celiac. Celiac would be if it targets the gut, but it can target a variety of different tissues. Celiac disease is the only autoimmune condition for which we know the trigger. And I know that there are other foods that can trigger similar symptomologies, but usually in the medical community that's been kind of ignored. You always have to consider any potential food as being a problem for someone. I had a woman come in one time. She was crippled up, came in on crutches. For 8 years she'd gone from one doctor to another trying to get help. One of the things I like to do when someone comes in, I like to see what they're eating. Because what I find is that if I look at their favorite foods, I can get a pretty good clue of what may be creating the problem. And so this woman was eating tomatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I said, I think we need to get you off tomatoes and see how you do. And she blew up. She became furious. She said, how can you ask me to give up my favorite food? And that kind of confirmed my thinking. So I shared with her the work of a researcher on nightshades, where he documented 87 cases of severe arthritic conditions that were induced by nightshade plants, potato, tomato, eggplant, bell pepper. And so she decided to go off the tomatoes, and within 2 weeks she was pain-free for the first time in 8 years. And then she thanked God for the spontaneous remission, ate tomatoes, and was crippled up for 2 days. So that kind of confirmed that it was the tomatoes. And so any food can potentially create problems. As we're talking about celiac, we're talking about something called autoimmunity, where the body turns and attacks its own tissue. There's 3 factors that you should keep in mind anytime someone says, I have an autoimmune condition. The first one is a genetic predisposition. In other words, there's something in the genes that will make a person more likely to have a bowel problem or a heart problem or a brain problem. Second thing is there's an environmental trigger. Someone said that genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And this is where the nutrients have an effect on the genetics to trigger the problem. But there's a third factor that has to be involved also, and that is a breach of the intestinal barrier so that the environmental trigger can interplay with the genetics. First thing, the novel role of the vitamin D receptor in maintaining the integrity of the intestinal mucosal barrier. Turns out that vitamin D is the regulator of the tight junction in zonulin, and if someone's vitamin D deficient, they lose the gateway that allows substances to pass from the inside of the gut into the bloodstream, and it just stays open all the time. And we have a lot of vitamin D deficiency in the United States. Now, if you get out in the sun for about 20 minutes in the middle of the day, you'll produce about 20,000 international units of vitamin D. But most people spend all their lives indoors. They never go outside. If they do, they put on sunscreen. Sunscreen prevents the vitamin D formation. So this is a very, very important nutrient. And that's why the chelated cow mag has increased dosage of vitamin D. And cod liver oil is also a very good source of both A and D. Crohn's disease is a permeability disorder of the tight junction. So relates it to Crohn's.